The clock on the wall of the Thorne farmhouse didn't tick so much as it shuddered, a rhythmic, dying gasp that mirrored the state of the land surrounding it. Elias Thorne stood in the gaping mouth of his barn at 3 in the morning, the air biting at his skin with a frost that felt personal. In his right hand, he clutched a crumpled piece of paper, a foreclosure notice. The ink was cold, the legal jargon sharp enough to draw blood. It was the final verdict. On 3 generations of Thorne's sweat and blood, the farm was dying, and Elias, at 34, felt like he was rotting right along with the timber. Behind him, through the thin, weathered walls of the house, he could hear the ghost of a sound. Maya, his 6-year-old, whimpering in her sleep. She was dreaming of a mother she barely remembered and a security that was currently being liquidated by a bank in the city. Nearby, in the converted closet they called a nursery, his infant son, Leo, began to wail. It wasn't a cry of pain, but of hunger, a demand for a bottle Elias wasn't sure he could afford to fill by the end of the week. The fridge was a cavern of expired milk and half-empty jars, and his pride was a hollow shell. Elias looked up at the sky, seeking some kind of divine intervention, or perhaps just a sign that the universe hadn't forgotten he existed. Instead, he saw headlights, twin beams of blinding white light cut through the oppressive rural darkness, sweeping across the rusted silo and the peeling white paint of the barn. A black SUV, sleek and predatory, rolled up the dirt driveway with a quiet hum that suggested an engine worth more than Elias's entire acreage. It didn't crawl tentatively like a lost traveler. It drove like it owned the horizon. The vehicle came to a halt, the gravel crunching beneath its expensive tires. For a long moment, Elias simply stood there, the foreclosure notice still a ball of misery in his fist. He felt a surge of defensive anger, the primal instinct of a man with his back against the wall. This was his dirt, his failure, and he didn't want an audience for it. The driver's side door swung open. A woman stepped out, and for a moment, the moonlight and the car's interior glow conspired to make her look like a hallucination. She wore a designer coat of charcoal wool that cost more than Elias's annual income, cinched tight at the waist. Her dark hair was pulled back into a severe, professional knot, revealing sharp, aristocratic features that belonged on the cover of a high-fashion magazine or in a glass-walled boardroom, not standing in the mud of a failing cattle farm in the middle of nowhere. She didn't look lost. She looked wrecked. Her eyes, dark and heavy with a fatigue that transcended mere lack of sleep, swept over him. She took in his worn flannel shirt, the frayed hems of his jeans, the muddy work boots, and the deep, permanent lines of exhaustion carved into his face. For a fleeting second, something flickered in her gaze, not pity, but a jagged sort of recognition. It was the look of one drowning person seeing another. She spoke 5 words that didn't just break the silence. They dismantled the entire trajectory of his life. I need a place to stay. Elias stared at her, his brain struggling to shift gears from the crushing weight of his debt to the absurdity of the woman standing before him. What he finally managed, his voice sounding like 2 stones grinding together. The woman didn't wait for an invitation. She didn't even wait for him to finish his thought. She reached into the back seat, pulled out a structured leather bag, and began walking toward the porch. Her heels clicked against the uneven boards with a sharp, rhythmic authority that silenced the crickets. Wait, hold on. Elias called out, stumbling after her. You can't just— Who are you? What are you doing here? She stopped at the front door, turning under the yellowed glow of the porch light. Up close, she looked younger than she had in the driveway, perhaps late 20s or early 30s, but her eyes were ancient. There was a hardness there, a defensive perimeter she had built around herself. Serafina, she said. Not Serafina Vance. Not I'm Serafina, nice to meet you. Just Serafina, as if the name itself carried enough weight to anchor her to the earth. That's great, Elias said, his voice rising in frustration. But Serafina, it's 3 in the morning. You don't just walk into a stranger's house. This isn't a motel. I'm not walking in, she countered, her voice calm but underlined with a tremor. He almost missed. I'm standing outside your locked door. Are you going to let me in, Or should I sleep in my car? Because frankly, I'm too tired to care. Which? Behind Elias, inside the house, Leo's crying escalated from a fuss to a full-blown, lung-bursting wail. The sound pierced through the night air, raw and demanding. Elias felt a headache crack his skull open, a dull throb behind his eyes that had been building since the bank's last phone call. He looked at the woman, this polished, expensive stranger, and then at his dark, crumbling home. He thought of the foreclosure notice, the medical bills, the empty cupboards, and the two children who needed him to be a hero when he felt like a ghost. Please, Serafina added. It wasn't an order this time. The word was quiet, stripped of its designer armor. It was the sound of someone who had reached the end of their rope and found it was frayed. Elias looked at her again, really looked. Beneath the perfect coat and the sharp features, she looked as broken as the fence he hadn't had the money to fix in 3 years. He shouldn't do it. It was reckless. It was dangerous. But he was so tired of being the only person holding things together. One night, he muttered, stepping past her to unlock the door. And you explain everything in the morning. Deal. Serafina nodded once, a crisp, businesslike motion. Deal. As the door swung open, the smell of the house hit them. Old wood. Cinnamon-scented candles long extinguished, and the faint, lingering scent of baby powder and desperation. Elias didn't look back to see if she followed. He headed straight for the stairs, taking them 2 at a time as Leo's screams grew louder. The nursery was a converted closet at the end of the hall, stuffy and dim. Leo was a red-faced, thrashing mess in his crib, his tiny fists waving at the shadows. I know, buddy, Elias murmured, scooping the infant up and tucking him against his shoulder. I know. I'm sorry. He carried the baby downstairs to the kitchen to heat a bottle, his movements mechanical and sluggish. When he reached the linoleum floor of the kitchen, he found Serafina already there. She was standing in the center of the room, her leather bag at her feet, cataloging every crack in the walls, every dirty dish in the sink, and the general aura of a life that was barely holding on by a thread. The guest room is upstairs, Elias said over Leo's howling. Second door on the left. The sheets are probably dusty. I haven't had a guest in, well, ever. Serafina didn't move toward the stairs. Where do you keep the formula? Elias blinked, pausing with his hand on the stove. What? The formula. The baby is hungry. I can hear it. I know he's hungry, Elias snapped, his temper fraying. I'm heating the water. Right now? I know how to feed my own son. The water should be warm, not hot, she said, her voice dropping into a tone of unexpected competence. And you should test it on your wrist first. You're doing it one-handed while barely standing upright. You're going to drop him or burn him. Let me help. I don't need. Please, she said for the second time that night. There it was again, that stripped-down desperation. Elias looked at his trembling hands. He looked at Leo, whose face was purple. With effort, his pride flickered, then died under the weight of his exhaustion. He couldn't remember the last time he'd slept more than 3 consecutive hours. He couldn't remember the last time someone had offered him a hand that wasn't trying to take something away. Fine, he muttered, handing the baby over. Serafina took Leo with a surprising, instinctive confidence. She adjusted her grip automatically, supporting his head and neck, swaying slightly in that universal rhythm that parents and caretakers know by heart. Leo's screaming didn't stop, but it downshifted into an angry, rhythmic fussing as he processed the change in arms. Elias turned back to the stove, pouring filtered water into a pot. How old is he? Serafina asked behind him. For months. His name is Leo. And the girl? I saw a pink backpack on the porch. Maya. She's 6. Elias measured out the formula powder with a shaking hand. Look, I appreciate the help, but you need to tell me what you're doing here. Why my farm? Why now? Running, Serafina said simply. Elias turned, the bottle in his hand. She was watching Leo's face, her own expression softened by the dim kitchen light. From what? People who want to control me, she said, her voice hard. People who want to use me as a piece on a board I never asked to play on. I saw your town on a map. Middle of nowhere. No 5-star hotels, no corporate offices, No one who would. Think to look for me here. This isn't a hotel, Elias reminded her. No, she agreed, her eyes meeting his. But I'll pay rent. Whatever you think is fair. More than fair. Elias let out a bitter, exhausted laugh. Lady, I don't think you understand. This place is falling apart. I can barely keep the lights on. The bank is about to take the dirt under our feet. There are actual motels 30 miles south that won't have mice in the walls. I don't want a motel, she said firmly. Elias finished the bottle, shook it, and tested a drop on his wrist. It was warm, not hot. He reached out to take Leo back, but Serafina didn't immediately let go. She looked at the infant, then at Elias. Why here? Elias asked again, his voice lower this time. She was quiet for a long moment, the only sound the rhythmic sucking of Leo as she guided the bottle into his mouth. The baby latched on instantly, his little body relaxing against her expensive wool coat. Because no one would believe I'd choose this, she whispered. And maybe I need to be somewhere where no one believes anything about me at all. Elias watched her feed his son. He felt like he was making a catastrophic mistake, letting a high society runaway into his home when he already had too many fires to put out. But as he watched the peaceful silence settle over the kitchen, he realized he didn't have the energy to fight her. 1 week, Elias said. You stay for 1 week. After that, you're gone. Thank you, she said. Don't thank me yet. You haven't seen this place in the daylight. Serafina almost smiled, a ghost of a shadow on her lips. I've seen worse. Elias Thorne. You'd be surprised what money can hide. She handed the now drowsy baby back to him. Her touch was brief, but he felt the warmth of her hand through his sleeve. Guest room, he repeated. Upstairs. Second door. Serafina nodded, picked up her bag, and headed for the stairs. At the doorway, she paused, looking back at him. Elias. Yeah. I meant what I said about the rent. I'm not here to take advantage. We'll talk about it in the morning, he said, turning his back to her so she wouldn't see the hope and the fear fighting for space on his face. He sat in the kitchen chair, Leo heavy and warm against his chest, and watched. The first gray light of dawn began to creep across the horizon. The foreclosure notice lay on the counter, a silent threat. But for the first time in months, the house didn't feel quite so empty. He had no idea who Serafina was or what she was running from. But as the sun began to rise over the dying Thorne farm, he knew that the midnight stranger had changed everything. The morning didn't arrive with a gentle glow. It struck like a physical blow. Elias woke to the sensation of a small, insistent hand shaking his shoulder and the rhythmic, soft snoring of Leo against his chest. His neck was stiff, a sharp pain radiating from the base of his skull, the inevitable price of falling asleep. In a hard kitchen chair. Daddy. Elias blinked, his eyes open, squinting against the harsh, unforgiving sunlight streaming through the grime-streaked window. Maya stood before him, her dark hair a tangled nest, her eyes wide with a mixture of confusion and a 6-year-old's innate sense for the unusual. She was still in her flannel pajamas, clutching a battered stuffed rabbit. Daddy, there's a lady in our kitchen, and she's making a lot of noise. Memory rushed back to Elias in a cold flood. The black SUV, the charcoal wool coat, the 5 words that had punctured his isolation. He sat up straighter, carefully shifting Leo, who let out a soft whimper but stayed asleep. I know, Maya, Elias whispered, his voice gravelly and thick with sleep. She's a guest. She's staying with us for a little while. Maya's brow furrowed. She had her mother's eyes, deep, questioning, and capable of seeing far more than Elias ever wanted her to see. Why? Does she have a home? Elias looked at the foreclosure notice still sitting on the counter, though now it was partially obscured by a designer leather handbag. She just needs a quiet place for a bit. Go put on some socks, okay? It's cold. As Maya patted away, Elias rose, his joints popping. He felt every bit of his 34 years, and then some. He carried Leo toward the kitchen, the scent of something alien drifting through the hallway. It wasn't the smell of burnt toast or cheap instant oats. It was the rich, aromatic scent of Real coffee, dark roast, expensive coffee, and the sizzle of bacon. He stopped in the doorway. Serafina had shed her charcoal coat. She was now wearing a silk blouse of deep emerald green, the sleeves rolled up to her elbows with crisp precision. Her hair was still perfectly knotted, though a few stray strands framed a face that looked remarkably focused. She was moving through his kitchen with a terrifying efficiency, having somehow located his one good cast-iron skillet and the half-pack of bacon he'd been saving for Sunday. She looked up as he entered, her dark eyes flicking to Leo and then to Elias's disheveled state. "The coffee is done," she said, her voice as smooth as it had been at 3 a.m. "And the eggs will be ready in 3 minutes. Sit down." Elias stayed rooted to the spot. "Where did you get coffee?" "I'm out. I have a French press and a hand grinder in my luggage," she replied, turning back to the stove to flip the bacon. "I don't travel without the essentials. And I used the eggs from your pantry. You really should keep them in the fridge, even if they are farm fresh." "I know how to store my eggs," Elias muttered, though the protest felt weak in the face of the breakfast feast she was conjuring. Maya appeared at his side, staring at Serafina with unblinking fascination. Serafina turned, a spatula in hand, and offered a small, measured nod. "Good morning, Maya. I'm Serafina." Maya stayed tucked behind Elias's leg. "Are you a princess?" The question hung in the air, absurd and poignant. Serafina's expression flickered, a brief, jagged shadow of something that looked like grief, before she smoothed it over with a cool mask. "No," Serafina said, her voice softening just a fraction. "I'm just someone who's very tired and needed a quiet place to sleep. Your father was kind enough to let me stay. Daddy's tired, too," Maya said matter-of-factly. "He's always tired. Sometimes he falls asleep in the barn, and I have to go wake him up." Elias felt a flush of heat creep up his neck. "Maya, that's enough. Sit down and eat." Serafina began plating the food. Golden scrambled eggs, crisp bacon, and even a few slices of toasted bread that she'd somehow managed not to burn in his temperamental toaster. She set a plate in front of Maya, then one in front of Elias. "I'm not a charity case," Elias said, looking at the food like it was a trap. "It's not charity," Serafina countered, sitting down across from them with her own plate and a porcelain mug that certainly didn't come from his cupboard. "It's a trade. I'm a terrible guest if I don't contribute. Consider this a down payment on the silence I'm buying." Elias picked up his fork. The first bite of the eggs was heaven, creamy, seasoned with salt and pepper he hadn't realized he still had. He realized then just how long it had been since he'd eaten a meal that wasn't designed purely for survival. They ate in a strange, heavy silence, broken only by the clinking of silverware and the gurgling of Leo, who had finally woken up and was happily swatting at a ray of sunlight. Elias watched Serafina. Even while eating, she held herself with a rigid, unnatural grace. She was here, in a kitchen that smelled of damp wood and failure, but she looked like she was waiting for a limousine to pull up. "So," Elias said, wiping his mouth. "About the rent." "500 a week," Serafina said. Elias choked slightly on his coffee. 500? For a dusty room in a house with a leaky roof? "I'm paying for the fact that you won't ask questions and that no one in this town knows who I am," she said, setting her mug down. "Is that acceptable?" It was more than acceptable. It was the difference between keeping the tractor and losing it. It was 2 months of Leo's formula. It was a stay of execution. "Acceptable," Elias managed. "But I have rules. You don't go poking around in the barn. You don't make promises to Maya you can't keep. And if I tell you it's time to go, you go. No arguments." Serafina leaned back, her emerald sleeves catching the light. "Agreed. And in return, I expect you to stay out of my business. If people come looking for a woman in a black SUV, you haven't seen me. Who would be looking for you? The kind of people who think money gives them the right to own a person's soul," she said, her voice turning brittle. "My business partners. My family. They think I've had a breakdown. They think I'm a liability because I wouldn't sign a merger that would have gutted my father's legacy." "Sterling," Elias remembered. "You said that was your name last night." "Serafina Sterling," she corrected. "But to you, I'm just Serafina." Maya looked up from her eggs, her face smeared with a bit of yolk. "Is your family mean?" Serafina looked at the little girl, and for the first time, the mask slipped. Her eyes grew glassy, a raw, naked vulnerability showing through. There, complicated Maya. Sometimes people get so busy looking at numbers that they forget how to look at people. Daddy looks at numbers, Maya said. He cries in the barn when he looks at the blue papers. The kitchen went dead silent. Elias felt the air leave his lungs. He wanted to disappear into the floorboards. He looked away, his jaw tight, his pulse thundering in his ears. The shame was a physical weight, a suffocating heat. Maya, go get your backpack, Elias said, his voice trembling with suppressed emotion. The bus will be here in 10 minutes. But I didn't finish. Now, Maya. The girl scrambled up, sensing the shift in the atmosphere, and ran from the room. Elias didn't look at Serafina. He focused on the dregs of his coffee, his hands gripped white-knuckled around the mug. He waited for the pity. He waited for the condescending offer of more money, or the look of disgust at a man who couldn't provide for his own. I lost my mother when I was 12, Serafina said quietly. Elias looked up, surprised. She was the only one who didn't look at me like a balance sheet, Serafina continued, her gaze fixed on the steam rising from her mug. After she died, my father stepped into her place, but he didn't fill it. He just paved over it with expectations. I know what it's like to look at a piece of paper and see the end of the world. It's not the end of the world, Elias said, his voice defensive. It's just a bad year. A few bad years. You don't have to lie to me, Elias. I'm not the bank. And I'm certainly not your daughter. She stood up, beginning to clear the plates with that same clinical efficiency. I'm going into town. I need to get some supplies. I'll be using your truck, if you don't mind. The SUV is too conspicuous. My truck? It's a rusted bucket of bolts. It's perfect, she said. Give me the keys. Elias hesitated, then reached into his pocket and tossed her the ring. Don't stall it in second. You have to give it a little extra gas. I can handle a manual transmission, Elias. I grew up on an estate, not in a penthouse. She grabbed her handbag and headed for the door. At the threshold, she paused, looking back at the kitchen, the peeling wallpaper, the sagging ceiling, the man holding a baby and trying to keep his dignity intact. The eggs were good, by the way, Elias said, the words feeling clumsy. Serafina nodded once, a sharp, elegant motion. I'll be back by 3. Make sure Maya is home. As the screen door slammed shut, Elias let out a breath he felt like he'd been holding since 3 in the morning. He looked down at Leo, who was now chewing contentedly on his own fist. Well, Leo, Elias whispered, I think the princess just bought us some time. The rest of the morning passed in a blur of mundane struggle. Elias took Leo out to the barn, strapped into a carrier that smelled of dust and old milk. He worked on the fence, the physical labor a welcome distraction from the chaotic thoughts spinning in his head. Every time he hammered a nail, he thought of Serafina Sterling. Who was she, really? A woman like that didn't just end up on a failing farm by accident. She was running from something massive, something that had the power to make a woman in a $1,000 coat feel like she had nowhere else to go. By 2:30, the old Thorn truck rattled back up the driveway. Elias wiped the sweat from his brow and watched as Serafina stepped out. She looked out of place against the backdrop of the rusted silo, her silk blouse stark against the gray wood of the barn. But she didn't look hesitant. She began unloading bags from the truck bed, groceries, real groceries, gallons of milk, fresh fruit, bags of flour, and a box that clearly contained diapers. He walked toward her, Leo bouncing on his chest. I didn't ask you to do this. I told you, I'm staying here. I'm not eating canned beans for a week, she said, handing him a heavy bag. And Leo was low on diapers. I took the liberty. I'll pay you back. Don't be tedious, Elias. It's part of the rent. They carried the supplies into the house just as the school bus rumbled to a stop at the end of the driveway. Maya bounded off, her backpack jumping against her shoulders. She stopped when she saw the truck parked near the house and Serafina standing on the porch. You're still here, Maya shouted, running up the steps. I am, Serafina said, and Elias noticed a genuine, if small, smile touch her lips. And I bought some strawberries. Would you like some? Maya's eyes lit up. Fresh fruit was a luxury they rarely saw outside of harvest season. As the afternoon turned into evening, the house felt different. It felt occupied. The silence that usually sat heavy in the corners was replaced by the sound of Maya chattering away to Serafina about her science project and the clatter of pans as Serafina prepared a dinner that smelled like actual food. Elias sat on the porch, watching the sun dip below the horizon. The Thorn farm was still dying. The debt was still there. The future was still a dark, uncertain road. But as he looked through the window and saw Serafina showing Maya how to hull a strawberry, he realized that for the first time in a very long time, he wasn't alone in the dark. Two worlds had collided on his doorstep at 3 a.m. One was built of dirt and struggle, the other of silk and secrets. Elias didn't know if they would survive the impact, but as he heard Maya laugh, a sound that had been too rare lately, he decided that maybe, just maybe, he was willing to find out. 1 week, he whispered to the approaching night. Just 1 week. But in his heart, Elias Thorne began to suspect that 7 days wouldn't be nearly enough. The third day began with a cold, relentless drizzle that turned the Thorne farm into a landscape of charcoal and mud. The rain hammered against the tin roof of the barn with a rhythmic intensity that Elias usually found soothing, but today, it felt like a countdown. Every drop was a reminder of the rot in the beams, the leaks in the attic, and the slow, inevitable erosion of everything he had left. Elias was in the barn, his breath blossoming in white plumes, struggling to repair a hydraulic line on the old tractor. His knuckles were raw, stained with grease and grit, and his back ached with a dull, familiar fire. He was a man of the earth, but lately, the earth felt like it was trying to swallow him whole. "You're holding the wrench wrong." Elias jumped, nearly banging his head against the tractor's undercarriage. He rolled out on his creeper, wiping grease onto a rag that was already more black than gray. Serafina stood in the doorway of the barn. She looked wildly out of place, yet strangely settled. She had traded her emerald silk for a thick, cable-knit cream sweater, likely worth more than the tractor itself, and a pair of dark leggings. She had found a pair of his old work boots in the mudroom. They were 4 sizes too big, but she had stuffed the toes with wool socks to make them stay on. "I'm holding it exactly how it needs to be held," Elias grunted, squinting at her. "What are you doing out here? The house is dry. This place is not. Maya is doing her drawings, and Leo is napping. The house is too quiet," she said, stepping into the barn. The smell of oil, hay, and damp earth seemed to pull a subtle reaction from her, not disgust, but curiosity. "And you've been out here for 3 hours. I assumed you'd either fixed it or died of frustration." "It's the latter," Elias admitted, sitting up and leaning his back against a massive rear tire. "This machine is older than I am. It doesn't want to work. It wants to be scrap metal." Serafina walked over, crouching beside him. She didn't mind the dirt on the floor. "In my world, when something stops working, we just replace it. We don't even look at the engine. We just call a different number." "Must be nice," Elias said, his voice devoid of malice but heavy with the weight of his own reality. "Here, if it breaks, you fix it. If you can't fix it, you learn. If you can't learn, you lose the harvest." Serafina reached out, her fingers hovering near the grease-covered manifold. "My father used to say that the only things worth owning are the things you can control." He spent his whole life trying to control the Sterling name, the Sterling assets. But he couldn't control the cancer that took my mother, and he couldn't control the fact that I didn't want to be his carbon copy. Elias watched her. The shadows in the barn played across her face, softening the sharp lines of her jaw. "Is that what you're running from? Control?" "I'm running from a man named Julian," she said, her voice dropping an octave. "He was my father's protege, my father's hand-picked successor. And for a brief, delusional time, he was my fiancé." Elias felt a strange, cold prickle in his chest. "A fiancé?" "It was a merger disguised as a romance," Serafina said, a bitter smile twisting her lips. "Julian doesn't love things. He acquires them. He acquired my father's trust, then his board of directors, and then he tried to acquire me. When I realized he was planning to dismantle my mother's charitable foundation, To pad the year-end dividends, I fought back. I blocked the merger. I used my veto power. She looked at her hands, which were clean, pale, and trembling. The next morning, the rumors started that I was unstable, that the grief of losing my father had broken my mind. Julian had doctors ready to sign commitment papers. He wanted me declared incompetent so he could take my shares. I left with a bag and a car before they could knock on my door. Elias looked at the foreclosure notice in his mind, then at the woman beside him. They were both being hunted by different kinds of monsters. His was made of paper and interest rates. Hers was made of silk ties and psychological warfare. I'm sorry, Elias said. It felt inadequate, but it was all he had. Don't be, she said, looking at him. It's just a different kind of rot. Yours is in the wood. Mine is in the blood. She stood up, dusting off her leggings. Now, show me how to fix this hydraulic line. I'm tired of being the person who just calls a number. Elias hesitated, then handed her a clean rag and a smaller wrench. For the next 2 hours, they worked in silence. He showed her how to thread the fittings, how to check for pressure leaks, and how to listen for the specific thrum of a healthy engine. She was a quick study, her hands precise and steady once she got past the initial hesitation of getting dirty. By the time the rain slowed to a misty shroud, the tractor roared to life, a cloud of blue smoke puffing into the rafters. Elias let out a jubilant shout, and to his surprise, Serafina laughed. It was a bright, genuine sound that echoed through the hollow space of the barn. You have grease on your nose, he said, smiling. She wiped at it, only making it worse. Did we do it? We did it. She'll run for another month, at least. They walked back to the house as the sky turned a bruised purple. Inside, the warmth of the wood stove greeted them. Maya was at the kitchen table, her crayons scattered like confetti. She looked up and gasped. Serafina, you're messy. Serafina looked down at her stained sweater and muddy boots. I'm a mechanic. Now, Maya, it's very serious business. Elias watched them, a lump forming in his throat. He went to the mudroom to peel off his layers, but stopped when he saw a framed photograph on the wall that he usually tried to avoid looking at. It was Sarah. She was standing in the very barn he'd just left, her hair windblown, a radiant smile on her face as she held a newborn Maya. He felt the old, jagged ache of loss. Sarah had been the heart of this place. She had known how to make the garden grow even in a drought. She had known how to calm Leo before he was even born. When the car accident took her 3 years ago, the farm had started to die because Elias simply didn't know how to keep it alive without her light. She was beautiful. Serafina was standing behind him, her voice soft. She was everything, Elias said, his voice thick. Her name was Sarah. She belonged here. I'm just the guy who's trying not to lose her ghost. Serafina stepped closer, but didn't touch him. She respected the boundary of his grief. You're not just a ghost keeper, Elias. Look at Maya. Look at Leo. You're building something new, even if the old parts are falling down. It's hard to build on a foundation that's being repossessed, Elias muttered, turning away from the photo. Then we changed the foundation, Serafina said. That night, after the kids were tucked in, they sat on the porch. The air was crisp, smelling of wet cedar and pine. Serafina had a laptop open on her knees, the glow of the screen reflecting in her eyes. I did some digging, she said. Elias tensed. Digging? Into your debt. Into the bank that holds your mortgage. She turned the screen toward him. Thorn Farm is a small fish to them. They're bundling these foreclosures to sell to a developer who wants to turn this valley into a luxury golf resort. Elias felt a flash of hot anger. A golf resort? This is Thornland. My grandfather is buried in the north pasture. I know, Serafina said. But Julian is the one behind the development group. Sterling Enterprises is the primary investor. Elias froze. The world suddenly felt very small and very dangerous. You're Julian? The one you're running from. He followed my trail to the regional banks, she whispered. He's buying up the land around me to force me out. He doesn't just want the company, Elias. He wants to prove that I can't hide from him. He's using your farm as a weapon. Against me. Elias stood up, his heart hammering against his ribs. So my life is just collateral damage in your corporate war? My kids lose their home because of your fiancé. Serafina stood too, her face pale in the moonlight. No, I didn't know it was this specific until tonight. But Elias, listen to me. If he's investing it, means he has to follow the Sterling bylaws. And according to those bylaws, A. Sterling heir has the right of first refusal on any distressed asset the company intends to purchase. What does that mean in English? It means if I can come up with the buyout price of your mortgage before the foreclosure goes to auction, I can legally strip the asset from the development group. I can buy the farm, Elias. Not for Julian, and not for the bank. For you. Elias stared at her. The offer was staggering. It was the answer to every prayer he'd ever whispered into the dark. But it felt like a different kind of cage. You'd own us. I'd be your partner, she corrected. I don't want the land, Elias. I want a place to stand. Julian thinks I'm a liability. I want to show him I'm an architect. Elias looked out over the dark fields. The shadows of the past were long. Sarah's absence, his father's failures, the weight of a century of Thorn tradition. But, for the first time, there was a light cutting through the dark. How much? He asked. Enough to make Julian bleed, she said, a fierce, cold fire in her eyes. But we have to move fast. He'll be here soon. He doesn't just send letters, Elias. He sends people. As if on cue, a pair of headlights appeared at the far end of the long dirt driveway. They weren't the quiet, refined lights of Serafina's SUV. These were bright, aggressive, and moving fast. Is that him? Elias asked, his hand dropping to the heavy iron wrench he'd left on the porch railing. No, Serafina whispered, her face going ghost white. Julian wouldn't come. Himself. Not yet. That's a scout. The black car stopped at the gate. A man stepped out, his silhouette sharp and predatory. He didn't say a word. He just stood there for a moment, looking at the house, then got back in and drove away. The message was clear. They had been found. Elias looked at Serafina. She looked terrified, but beneath the fear, there was that same iron resolve he'd seen when she fixed the tractor. She wasn't just a princess in a high-fashion coat anymore. She was a thorn in spirit, stubborn, resilient, and ready to fight for the dirt under her feet. 1 week, Elias said, his voice steady. That's what I promised you. But if we're going to fight this, I think we're going to need more than a week. Serafina reached out, and, for the first time, she took his hand. Her palm was calloused from the wrench, her grip firm. We fight for the farm, Elias. Together. The shadows of the past were still there, lurking in the corners of the house, and the depths of their hearts. But as they stood on the porch, watching the taillights of the scout car disappear into the mist, the midnight stranger and the dying farmer realized they weren't just surviving anymore. They were declaring war. And the Thorn farm, for all its rot and ruin, had never felt more alive. The dawn that followed the scout's visit was not a herald of peace, but a call to arms. The mist clung to the valleys of the Thorn farm like a cold, damp shroud, obscuring the horizon and turning the familiar silhouette of the rusted silo into a ghostly sentinel. Elias Thorn didn't sleep. He spent the remaining hours of the night sitting in the darkness of the kitchen, a cold cup of coffee on the table and a heavy iron poker resting against his chair. He watched the driveway through the slats of the blinds, his ears attuned to every groan of the settling house, every rustle of the wind in the dying cornstalks. Beside him, the kitchen table had been transformed into a command center. Serafina's laptop hummed, its blue light casting sharp, angular shadows across her face. She had traded her silk and wool for the rugged attire of a woman, ready for a siege, her fingers flying across the keys with a frantic, rhythmic precision. The paperwork is in motion, she whispered, her voice gravelly from exhaustion. I've triggered the right of first refusal clause. My mother's lawyers, the ones Julian hasn't managed to buy yet, are filing the injunction in the city as we speak. But Julian won't sit idle. He'll try to accelerate the foreclosure auction. He'll try to prove that this farm is a public nuisance or a hazardous liability to justify a forced immediate sale. Elias looked at her, the fatigue etched into the corners of his eyes. He's coming for the dirt, Serafina. But he's also coming for you. Why is he so obsessed with this specific piece of land? There are 1,000 failing farms in this state. Serafina paused, her gaze fixed on a digital map of the county. Because it's the only place he can't see into. Julian's power comes from surveillance, financial, social, digital. This farm is a black hole on his map. As long as I'm here, and as long as I'm protected by the Thorn name, I'm a variable he can't solve. And Julian hates unsolved variables. She turned the screen toward him. Look at the zoning records I pulled. The golf resort is a front. Beneath this valley, there's a massive shale deposit. Julian doesn't want to build a green. He wants to build a fracking empire. He's been buying up mineral rights under the table for years. Your farm is the final piece of the puzzle, the crown jewel of his extraction site. Elias felt a cold, hard knot form in his stomach. It wasn't just about golf or development. It was about the destruction of the land his grandfather had cleared by hand. It was about poisoning the well that Sarah used to draw water from to wash Maya's hair. He'll never touch it, Elias said, his voice a low, dangerous rumble. Not while I'm breathing. Then we make it a fortress, Serafina said, her eyes meeting his with a shared, desperate resolve. The morning brought a different kind of activity to the Thorn farm. Usually, the hours were filled with the slow, grinding labor of maintenance and the quiet struggle of survival. Today, there was a sense of urgency. Elias and Serafina worked with a synchronized intensity, while Serafina handled the digital and legal front, navigating trust funds, filing affidavits, and recording every movement on the property for harassment evidence. Elias focused on the physical. He spent the morning boarding up the weak points in the barn and repairing the perimeter fence with a ferocity that left his hands bloody. He moved with a purpose he hadn't felt in years. He wasn't just fixing a fence, he was defining a border. Maya was an observant spectator to the chaos. She sat on the porch steps, her sketchbook in her lap, drawing the princess and her father. In her drawings, Serafina had a sword and Elias had a shield. The innocence of the imagery struck Elias like a physical blow. He realized that for Maya, this wasn't just a legal battle. It was a fairy tale turned nightmare. Daddy, Maya called out as Elias hauled a heavy roll of barbed wire toward the north pasture. Is the mean man coming today? Elias stopped, wiping the sweat from his brow. He knelt down, meeting his daughter's eyes. The mean man is going to try, Maya. But Serafina and I are standing at the gate, and nobody gets past us. You understand? Maya nodded, her lip trembling slightly. Because we're thorns? Because we're thorns, Elias promised. The first direct strike didn't come with a car or a scout. It came through the mailbox. At noon, a courier on a motorcycle roared up the driveway, kicking up a plume of dust. He handed Elias a thick, manila envelope and left without a word. Inside were a dozen documents, all bearing the Sterling Enterprises seal. It was a cease and desist order, coupled with a notice of environmental violation. Julian's lawyers were claiming that the Thorn Farm's old septic system was leaking into the regional watershed, a fabricated claim designed to trigger a government-mandated evacuation. Serafina read through the documents, her face pale. He's using the state regulators. If they show up and declare this place a biohazard, the right of first refusal won't matter. They can seize the land under eminent domain for public safety and sell it to the highest bidder, which will be Julian's shell company. How long do we have? Elias asked. The inspectors will be here by sunset, Serafina said, looking at the clock. Julian doesn't do things by halves. He's already called in the favors. Elias looked at the barn, then at the house. He thought of his grandfather's records, buried in an old trunk in the attic. My grandfather was meticulous, Elias said, his mind racing. He kept the original survey maps and the inspection receipts for every pipe laid on this land. He knew the county would try to squeeze him one day. He called it land insurance. They scrambled to the attic, the air thick with the scent of dust and memories. They tore through boxes of old flannel, Sarah's sewing kits, and Maya's baby clothes. Finally, in the very corner, Elias found the heavy, iron-bound trunk. Inside were the scrolls of the Thorn legacy, hand-drawn maps, notarized letters. from the 1950s, and, most importantly, the blue ribbon certification of a private, deep well filtration system that was entirely self-contained and disconnected from the regional watershed. This is it, Serafina breathed, scanning the documents. Julian's claim is based on the assumption that you're connected to the valley grid. This proves you're an independent entity. Legally, the county has no jurisdiction over your groundwater unless they can prove a surface spill, which we know doesn't exist. She looked at Elias, a triumphant light in her eyes. We have the shield, Elias. Now we just need to hold the line. The inspectors arrived at 5 o'clock. They came in 2 white trucks, followed by a sleek, black sedan that looked like a shark cutting through the mist. Out of the sedan stepped a man in a charcoal suit. Not Julian, but his lead counsel. A man named Marcus Vane. He was the personification of corporate coldness, his eyes scanning the Thorn farm with a look of clinical disdain. Elias and Serafina stood on the porch, Maya tucked safely inside with Leo. Mr. Thorn, Marcus Vane said, his voice as smooth as oiled silk. I'm here with the County Environmental Board. We have reason to believe your property is in violation of the Watershed Act of 2012. We're here to conduct a mandatory inspection and serve the evacuation order. Elias stepped forward, the iron-bound documents clutched in his hand. You're on private Thorn land, Mr. Vane, and according to the county charter, Article 4, you have no jurisdiction over private deep well systems that are self-contained and certified by the state, which mine is. He tossed the notarized documents onto the hood of Vane's car. Marcus Vane's expression didn't change, but his fingers twitched as he picked up the papers. He scanned them quickly, his jaw tightening. Behind him, the county inspectors looked at each other, hesitant. These are dated, Vane said, his voice losing a fraction of its silk. They're notarized and perpetual. Serafina stepped forward, her voice ringing with the authority of a woman who had spent her life in boardrooms. And as the majority shareholder of Sterling Enterprises, the primary investor in the development group seeking this land, I am officially filing a conflict of interest suit against you, Mr. Vane, and your firm. You are using public resources for a private land grab. If those inspectors step 1 foot onto this grass without a court-ordered warrant based on real evidence, I will have their licenses and your bar registration by morning. The silence that followed was absolute. The wind died down, and for a moment, the only sound was the rhythmic thumping of the Thorn house's heart. Marcus Vane looked at Serafina, his eyes narrowing. Julian was right about you've become erratic. I've become a thorn, Serafina countered. Now get off our land. The inspectors, sensing the legal firestorm they were about to walk into, retreated to their trucks. Marcus Vane lingered for a moment, his gaze shifting to Elias. You're fighting a god, Mr. Thorn, Vane whispered. And gods don't lose to farmers. They do when the farmer owns the dirt the god is standing on, Elias replied. The cars turned around and roared back down the driveway, the dust settling slowly in their wake. A small victory, but a victory nonetheless. That night, the atmosphere on the Thorn farm was one of wary celebration. Elias made a fire in the hearth, the warmth pushing back the autumn chill. They sat on the floor, Elias, Serafina, and Maya, eating a simple dinner of stew and the bread Serafina had baked. Leo was asleep in his crib, his breathing a steady, peaceful anchor. Maya looked from her father to Serafina. Did we win? Elias looked at Serafina. Her cream sweater was stained with dust from the attic. Her hair was coming loose from its knot, and she had a smudge of dirt on her cheek. She looked more beautiful than she ever had in her silk blouses. We won the battle, Maya, Serafina said, reaching out to tuck a stray hair behind the girl's ear. But the mean man is going to try one more time. He's going to bring the whole army. Let him come, Maya said, her chin lifted. We have the maps. Elias laughed, a sound that felt foreign but welcome in his chest. He looked at Serafina, and the weight of the last 3 years seemed to lighten, if only for a moment. He realized that home wasn't just the land or the house. It was the people willing to bleed for it. I never thought I'd see a sterling fight like that, Elias said after Maya had gone to bed. I'm not a sterling tonight, Serafina said, staring into the embers of the fire. I'm just Serafina, and for the first time in my life, I feel like I'm standing on solid ground. Elias reached out, his hand covering hers. Their fingers intertwined, his rough and calloused, hers trembling but strong. You're a thorn, Serafina, in every way that matters. They sat in the quiet of the house, two souls forged in different worlds, brought together by a midnight storm and a shared refusal to break. The war for the Thorn Farm was far from over. Julian would be back, and he would bring the full weight of his empire down upon them. But as the fire burned low and the darkness pressed against the windows, Elias Thorn didn't feel like a dying man anymore. He felt like a guardian. And beside him, the midnight stranger had become the heart of the fortress. The fighting for home had only just begun, but the Thorn Farm was no longer a place of rot and ruin. It was a battlefield, and they were ready. The final assault on the Thorn Farm did not begin with the roar of engines or the shouting of men. It began with a silence so profound it felt like the world had held its breath. A week had passed since the environmental inspectors were driven back, a week of grueling preparation and whispered strategies. Elias and Serafina had lived in a state of hypervigilance, their lives reduced to the perimeter of the fence and the glow of the laptop screen. On the 8th morning, the fog was particularly thick, a white wall that erased the woods and the hills. Elias stood on the porch, a mug of black coffee in his calloused hands, watching the driveway. He felt a strange sense of calm. The fear that had paralyzed him for 3 years, the fear of losing Sarah's legacy, of failing his children, had hardened into something else. It was a cold, sharp resolve. He was no longer a victim of circumstance. He was a sentry. He's here, Serafina said, stepping out onto the porch behind him. She didn't need to see the cars to know. She felt the shift in the air, the arrival of the man who had haunted her dreams since she fled the city. 3 black SUVs emerged from the mist, moving in a slow, funerary procession. They stopped at the gate, which Elias had reinforced with heavy timber and chains. From the lead vehicle, a man stepped out. He was tall, dressed in a bespoke navy overcoat that seemed to repel the dampness of the morning. Julian. He didn't look like a monster. He looked like a king coming to inspect a rebellious province. He walked to the gate and waited, his hands tucked casually into his pockets. Stay with the kids, Elias said, his voice low. No, Serafina replied, her voice firm. This ends today, Elias. I won't hide in the cellar while you defend a house I've made my own. They walked down the steps together, a united front of denim and wool against the polished steel of Julian's world. As they reached the gate, Elias felt the weight of Julian's gaze. It was a look of profound condescension, the way a scientist might look at a particularly stubborn microbe. Serafina, Julian said, his voice a smooth baritone that carried easily through the damp air. You've lost weight. The rustic life doesn't seem to suit you as well as you imagined. I've never felt better, Julian, she countered, her hand resting on the wooden gate. The air is cleaner here. No rot. No deception. Julian smiled, a cold, clinical movement of his lips. And this is the hero? The man who's been sheltering a fugitive from her own responsibilities? He looked at Elias, his eyes lingering on the grease under his fingernails and the fraying collar of his shirt. Mr. Thorn, I presume. You've caused a great deal of trouble for my legal department. I suppose I should admire the grit, however futile it is. The gate is locked, Elias said, his voice like grinding stone. The land is private. State your business and get off my dirt. Julian sighed, a sound of exaggerated patience. My business is simple. I'm here to offer you a way out. I've reviewed your financials, Mr. Thorn. You are a drowning man. I am offering you $1 million for this property. Cash. You can take your children, move to the city, buy a house with a roof that doesn't leak, and never have to worry about a harvest again. All you have to do is sign the deed and step aside so I can take Serafina back to the help she so clearly needs. Elias felt the pull of it, the sheer, staggering weight of that much money. It was the siren song of safety. He could buy Maya everything she ever wanted. He could guarantee Leo's future. But then he felt the ground beneath his boots. He felt the presence of Sarah in the barn behind him, and the heat of Serafina at his side. You think everything has a price, Elias said. But you don't understand dirt. You don't understand that this isn't just an asset. It's a thorn. My grandfather's sweat is in this soil. My wife's laughter is in that house. You can't buy that. And you sure as hell can't buy me. Julian's smile vanished, replaced by a mask of cold, corporate indifference. I thought you might be difficult. Pride is a common affliction among the impoverished. But pride doesn't pay the bank. Marcus Vane told you, Mr. Thorne. Gods don't lose to farmers. Julian signaled to the men in the other SUVs. They began to step out, men in tactical gear, carrying legal injunctions and the heavy tools of forced entry. I'm not a farmer today, Julian. Serafina stepped forward, pulling a thick folder and a satellite phone from her jacket. I'm the majority shareholder of Sterling Enterprises. And you're fired. Julian froze. What are you talking about? You're in no position to. While you were busy buying up regional banks and sending scouts, I was busy communicating with the board of directors, Serafina said, her voice rising. With a terrifying authority. The board members you thought were loyal? They're loyal to profit, Julian. And I showed them the projected lawsuits from the environmental fraud you attempted here. I showed them the secret fracking contracts you signed without their approval. I showed them that you were using company funds to pursue a personal vendetta against an heir. She hit a button on the satellite phone. You're on speaker, Richard. A new voice filled the air, Richard Sterling, the most senior board member and Serafina's uncle. Julian, the board has convened an emergency session. Your voting rights have been suspended pending a full audit of the Thorn Farm acquisition. Marcus Vane has already turned state's evidence to avoid a racketeering charge. You are to cease all actions on behalf of the company. Immediately, Julian's face went from pale to a livid, mottled red. The king had been stripped of his crown in the middle of a mud-slicked driveway. This is a bluff. You can't. The men behind you? They're not your security anymore, Julian, Serafina said. They're Sterling security, and they've been instructed to escort you to the airport. Your career is over. Your empire is a pile of legal ash. The men in tactical gear looked at each other, then at Julian. They didn't move toward the gate. They moved toward Julian. Julian looked at Serafina, a look of pure, unadulterated hatred. You think you've won? You think you can live here? In this ruin? You're a Sterling. You'll be back in the city within a month, begging for the life you threw away. I'm not a Sterling, she whispered, her eyes meeting Elias's. I'm a Thorn. The SUVs turned around, Julian being forced into the back of the lead vehicle. The mist swallowed them once more, the sound of their engines fading into the distance until the silence of the farm returned. But it was a different silence. Now, it wasn't the silence of death, it was the silence of a clean slate. Elias and Serafina stood at the gate for a long time, watching the white wall, where the cars had vanished. The adrenaline was receding, leaving a bone-deep weariness in its wake. Is it over? Elias asked, his voice cracking. The war is over, Serafina said. She leaned her head against the wooden post of the gate. The lawyers will be busy for years, and Julian will likely spend a decade in court, but he'll never touch this land again. Elias turned to her. He saw the grease on her hands, the dirt on her boots, and the fierce, beautiful light in her eyes. You saved us. You could have just taken the company and gone back. You didn't have to stay for the finish. I didn't do it for the company, Elias, she said, stepping closer. I did it for the place where I belong. I spent my whole life in glass towers, looking down at the world. I never knew what it felt like to have the earth under my fingernails and a reason to wake up that didn't involve a stock price. She looked at the house, where Maya was watching them from the window, Leo, likely waking up for his morning bottle. I don't have the $1 million Julian offered, she said softly. But I have the trust fund my mother left me. It's enough to pay off the bank, fix the roof, buy a new tractor, and keep this farm running for another century. I want to be your partner, Elias. Not just on paper. I want to be here. For Maya. For Leo. For you. Elias felt a lump form in his throat that he couldn't swallow. He looked at the north pasture, where his grandfather lay. He looked at the barn, where Sarah's memory was no longer a weight, but a blessing. It's not an easy life, Elias warned, his voice thick with emotion. There's mud and cold, and things break every day. I'm a mechanic now, remember? Serafina smiled, and this time it reached her. Eyes, radiant and full of hope. I can handle a little mud. Elias reached out and pulled her into his arms. He kissed her, a kiss that tasted of rain and earth and a future they had fought for together. For the first time in 3 years, the Thorn Farm didn't feel like a dying thing. It felt like a sanctuary. 6 months later, the spring had come to the valley with a riot of green and the smell of blooming apple blossoms. The Thorn Farm was transformed. The barn had a new roof of gleaming silver tin. The fences were straight and sturdy, and the old tractor had been replaced by a modern machine that hummed with quiet power. Elias stood in the garden, watching Maya chase a butterfly through the rows of emerging vegetables. She was taller, her laughter ringing out across the hills, a sound of pure, unburdened joy. Leo was sitting on a blanket nearby, trying to eat a blade of grass, his chubby legs kicking with excitement. The screen door creaked open, and Serafina stepped out onto the porch. She was wearing a simple cotton dress and work boots, her hair tied back in a loose braid. She carried a tray of lemonade, the ice clinking against the glass. She looked at Elias and smiled. It wasn't the smile of a princess or a CEO. It was the smile of a woman who was exactly where she was meant to be. The lawyer called, she said, joining him in the garden. The final papers were signed. The Thornland Trust is official. This valley can never be developed. It stays green forever. Elias took her hand, his fingers intertwining with hers. He looked at his children, at his land, and at the woman who had walked out of the midnight mist to save them all. We're home, Elias whispered. Yes, Serafina replied, leaning her head against his shoulder. This is the place where we belong. The midnight stranger had become the heart of the Thorn Farm, and the dying farmer had found a new reason to grow. As the sun set over the hills, casting long, golden shadows across the flourishing fields, the Thorn Farm was no longer just a piece of history. It was a promise of dirt and silk, and a love that had bloomed in the ruins of the past to create a future that was, finally, their own.